Over the last 3 years, we've relied on these two devices at home to set timers, check the weather, and check if insert name of celebrity here is still alive. This week, I'm replacing them with HomePods and Siri. So a few weeks back, I took delivery of the brand new HomePod, you know, the HomePod which we thought was dead and came back from the dead completely unexpectedly at the start of this year. And I'd never heard that big HomePod before. I had a HomePod mini which was, well, I was fairly underwhelmed by, but the big one was a new experience for me. I'll give you my updated thoughts on the sound of the new HomePod in a moment, but as I mentioned, I do have another task ahead of me, which is to replace the huge Echo Studio, which does look suspiciously like a HomePod, and the tiny Echo Dot, which looks suspiciously like a HomePod mini, with HomePods. And I am a little bit nervous about this, as is my girlfriend, because we have been relying on these two devices for the last 3 years. We don't do much with them, but they do play a very important role in our family. I mean, without them, we'd never know if our eggs were done or not, so they're really important. And Siri, well, it doesn't have the best track record. I've already ripped these out of the house, as you can see, so all that remains is to get those HomePods set up and see what happens. If you're watching this video, I'm guessing that you're an iPhone person as well, in which case you might be interested in today's sponsor, which is Casekoo and their fantastic Magic Stand iPhone case. For starters, it's a fantastic case which only adds 2mm to your phone. There's lots of different colours, including this new clear silver type one, which I really like. But also, it's got this very useful, in fact more useful than you imagine, kickstand built in, which is built for 30,000 plus openings. And this is one of those things that you don't know you need until you try it. And basically you can angle this anywhere between 40 to 120 degrees and place your phone on your desk while you're eating your lunch and watching your favorite YouTube channels, or perhaps on the floor while you're doing workouts. It's so useful. It's got a 48-piece magnet structure in here as well, so yes, your MagSafe stuff still works with it. And the good news is that I've worked with Casekoo to get you a 10% discount. So if you want to check out the Casekoo Magic iPhone stand, click the link in the description. One of the things that annoys me the most about Home Assistant speakers like this is what you do with the cables. Because in the perfect world of Apple marketing, when you see them in adverts, you never see the cables. Oh, it's just messy. Okay, so let's introduce you to my new HomePod/Siri setup. In the kitchen, we now have the 2023 HomePod. This is the brand new one. This is replacing the Amazon Studio that you saw earlier. It's quite a bit smaller, which is nice, and yeah, I still hate that cable. Then we have a HomePod mini, which I've had since launch and used an embarrassingly sparing number of times. And finally, we have an Apple TV 4K, which has been the main source of entertainment in this living room for the last 2 years. It's fantastic. The reason it makes this list is because 1, it has Siri built into it, and 2, I can stream music between those two HomePods and this Apple TV, giving me sound everywhere, in theory. Right, as promised, some updated thoughts on the new big HomePod. I unboxed it and gave it a first listen a few weeks back. If you missed that video, I'll link to it above. I wasn't as underwhelmed with it as I was with the HomePod mini. It is still an impressive sound. But 1, there was a bit too much distortion for my liking, and 2, it just wasn't very exciting. However, as a few of you pointed out, I was sat there listening to it right in front of me. That isn't the idea with HomePods. What you're supposed to do is put them somewhere in the room and forget about them. And that's because the HomePod analyzes the room, it uses adaptive EQ and all this clever fancy stuff to, in theory, make it sound good no matter where you put it. And it's also not a traditional speaker. It doesn't fire straight at you. It's firing all over the place. So me sitting there and listening to it like that wasn't the best test. And interestingly, after that first listen, I just left it on the desk in the studio for 2 or 3 weeks and got on with my work. And you know what? I really started to warm to that sound. So the plan now is to use these two HomePods as we were using those two Amazon devices. Firstly, to see if the switch to Siri is okay or frustrating. That's the first question that I've got. And secondly, to see what the sound's like. You know, does the HomePod, the big HomePod, sound good in this kitchen? Does the HomePod Mini sound okay in the dining room? And does the syncing between all three devices, the HomePod Mini and the Apple TV, work reliably? So I'm going to give it a couple of days and then return with my full conclusion, which to you will be a few seconds, because when I click my fingers, I'll be in the studio. Okay, so we've been using this new HomePod setup at home for the last 2 days, and firstly, sonically, I'm impressed. Definitely the key with this HomePod is to put it in the corner of the room or somewhere in your room and forget it exists, because when you do that, all of that computational audio and stuff does seem to work. It definitely sounds better than the Echo Studio that it replaced, which is a bit of a dull sounding speaker, to be fair. There is still some distortion, which bothers me, and there is a setting in, funnily enough, in the HomePod settings in the Home app, which is a bit of a faff to get to, but basically in there you can set, I think it's called reduce bass. That doesn't fix it, because all that does is remove the bass completely. The syncing between the HomePod Mini and the Apple TV 4K is pretty flawless. It's nice to have that in place. The only thing is that Siri does get a bit confused sometimes trying to work out whether you want to play music on just the HomePod in the kitchen versus everywhere. That seems to be a bit of an issue, but I'll come on to Siri in a moment. But apart from that, having this kind of, you know, house-filling sound with HomePods and an Apple TV is actually pretty convenient. And true to Apple form, both the HomePod Mini and the 2023 HomePod look better than Amazon's efforts. I just wish it was still plain sailing from this point onwards, but it's not. The topic of home assistants has been hotly debated, I think it's fair to say. In my experience, Amazon's effort is, I think, the best, personally. And I think it's fair to say that Siri hasn't had an easy ride. And that's why I was nervous of swapping out those Echo devices for these HomePods. We've relied on Amazon's Assistant for 3 years, and it's been pretty much flawless. So the big question is, can Siri match at home? On first impressions, no. Firstly, one positive aspect is that my girlfriend did note that Siri seems to be a bit nicer, a little bit less assertive than Alexa, which would be fine if, like I say, Siri wasn't quite so slow to the party. Answers still take ages to arrive sometimes, if they do, because quite often we still get that "here's what I found on the web" response, which is so irritating. One of the other issues with the HomePods that we found is that, in theory, they're supposed to recognise different voices throughout your household, which sounds great in theory, but in practice we cannot get this to work. To begin with, the HomePod in the kitchen thought Jen was me, and trust me, we sound very different. And then after a bit of Google searching and going through Apple's knowledge base, which I don't think you should have to do, but anyway, going through that, I realised that you have to add that other person into your Home app as a resident. So we did that, and it still doesn't work. Whenever Jen asks Siri who she is, Siri replies with, "Oh, you need to update your name in the Siri settings on your phone," which are already set with the correct name. So answers on a postcard, please. Another problem is that all of the devices in our house pretty much now listen out for Siri. That seems to play havoc with the HomePod. So a great example of this was last night when I was cooking dinner. I set a timer on the HomePod in the kitchen. I then put my AirPods in and started listening to a podcast, and whenever I asked Siri to let me know how long was left on the timer, my phone told me there was no timer set because the timer had been set on the HomePod. I know this isn't a simple solution. I know this is quite a big technical challenge for Apple to get this right, because all of these devices are listening for you to say Siri, and the right one has to respond. But when you start adding lots of Siri devices to your home, including HomePods, it starts to get a bit confusing. Another thing that's really annoying is that you have to be very specific with your requests. The radio station in this county, the name of it goes on for months, and if you miss out one of those words in that radio station name, you will not get that radio station. Instead, you'll get some random album track from a band you've never heard of, and you'll probably be the first person to hear that song beyond the singer's mum. So it is early days with Siri at home, but boy does Apple's Assistant need to up its game. There's a lot to like with this new big HomePod. The sound is getting better, 100%. I think it looks great. It's just let down by Siri. It's let down by the Home Assistant part of it. I just hope that this year Apple finally makes some headway with Siri. It's been far too long, to be honest, but because their focus on home has increased significantly over the last 2 or 3 years, surely Siri is going to get better. But it is early days with this HomePod setup, so I will return with further thoughts. Make sure you subscribe and hit the bell not to miss those videos. And yes, I promise I will try out a stereo pair. Everyone keeps asking me to do that, so I will do that at some stage as well. And also, there's some interesting competition on the way from Sonos in the Era 100 and Era 300. These are 2 new products from Sonos. They're more expensive than the HomePod equivalents, but they look very interesting, and I will be reviewing them very soon. So again, make sure you stay tuned for those. And if you want to see my original first reaction listen to the new HomePod, keep watching for a link to that video.